She walked toward a man the entire city feared, and no one stopped her. Not because they didn't care, but because they were too terrified to try. Adrian Volkov stood at that altar like a king receiving tribute, not a groom awaiting a bride. And Clara Bennett walked toward him in silk that felt like a funeral shroud, convinced she was being sacrificed to save everyone she loved. But here's what neither of them understood in that moment. This was not the beginning of her destruction. This was the beginning of the only love story neither of them ever planned to survive. If this story already has your heart, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The rain came without warning. One moment the sky above St. Catherine's Cathedral was the color of old pewter, heavy and still, the kind of stillness that precedes something irreversible. The next, it split open. Not gradually, not politely, but all at once, though the way terrible things tend to happen. Water hammered the stone steps of the cathedral, streamed down the iron lampposts lining the boulevard, and turned the street below into a river of black mirrors reflecting a city that had learned, long ago, not to ask too many questions about what happened inside certain buildings on certain nights. The guests who had arrived early enough scrambled beneath the cathedral's stone archways. The ones who hadn't were left to stand in the downpour, too afraid to leave, too uncomfortable to speak, because this was not the kind of wedding you were invited to. This was the kind of wedding you were summoned to attend. And when Adrian Volkov summoned you, you came. You stood in the rain if that was what was required. You kept your mouth shut and your eyes forward, and you were grateful, deeply, quietly grateful, that it was someone else standing at that altar and not you. Inside, the cathedral was dry and cold and lit by hundreds of ivory candles that threw long shadows across the stone floors. The pews were filled with men in expensive suits and women in gowns that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Politicians, business owners, lawyers who had made careers out of asking the right questions and forgetting the wrong answers. They sat with the particular posture of people performing composure, backs straight, expressions neutral, hands folded in laps that had gone slightly damp with perspiration. At the front of the aisle, between the altar and the first row of candles, Adrian Volkov waited. He was not a particularly tall man, though he seemed tall. There was something about the way he occupied space that made rooms feel smaller, ceilings feel lower, oxygen feel marginally scarcer. He wore a black suit so precisely fitted that it appeared to have been constructed around him rather than tailored for him. A white shirt with no tie, and silver cufflinks that caught the candlelight with a cold, almost surgical gleam. His hair was dark with threads of silver running through it, not the silver of aging, but the silver of something harder. Iron left in weather, perhaps, or steel that had been through heat and emerged changed. His face was all sharp angles and controlled stillness, the kind of face that gave nothing away because it had spent decades practicing the discipline of giving nothing away. He stood with his hands clasped at his waist, watching the cathedral doors with an expression that the assembled guests privately interpreted in very different ways. Some saw patience, some saw hunger, some saw the particular cold focus of a man who has already decided how a situation will end and is simply waiting for reality to catch up with his intention. None of them were entirely right. None of them were entirely wrong. The doors opened. Clara Bennett had been awake since 3 a.m, not by choice, by the particular cruelty of a mind that knew what was coming and refused to allow the mercy of sleep. She had lain on her back in the narrow bed of the hotel room that someone, she didn't know who, she had stopped asking questions about logistics, had arranged for her the night before, and she had stared at the ceiling and listened to the city outside the window breathe and shift and carry on with complete indifference to the fact that her life was ending. Not ending in the literal sense. She was not going to die today. She had told herself this repeatedly, quietly, in the dark, like a mantra. You are not going to die today. People survive arranged marriages. People survive worse than this. You are going to walk into that building and you are going to do what needs to be done and you are going to survive. But survival, she had begun to understand, was not the same as living. And there was a version of yourself that could be lost in a single afternoon that no amount of physical survival could recover. The wedding dress had arrived at 6 a.m, carried in by a woman Clara had never met, hung in a garment bag of thick black cloth that seemed wrong for the occasion. Wrong color, wrong weight, wrong energy, like something that belonged at a different kind of ceremony entirely. The woman had hung it on the back of the bathroom door without speaking, met Clara's eyes for precisely half a second, and then left. Clara had stood in front of it for a long time. The dress itself was objectively beautiful. She could acknowledge that from a distance, the way you could acknowledge that a painting was beautiful even when it depicted something terrible. It was ivory silk, floor length, with a structured bodice and a skirt that moved like water when she finally took it off the hanger, and sleeves of delicate lace that reached her wrists. It had probably cost more than she earned in 6 months at the hospital. It was the kind of dress that belonged in photographs, in memories, in the specific constellation of images a woman built around the idea of the best day of her life. Wearing it, Clara felt like she was drowning in slow motion. She sat now in the back of a black car, another car she hadn't arranged, driven by another man she'd never met, watching the city slide past the rain-blurred window, and she thought about her mother. Her mother, who had called her 2 nights ago, voice stretched thin with a guilt she was trying very hard to muffle beneath practicality. Clara, you have to understand the situation. You have to understand what's at stake. It's not just the debt. It's everything. It's your father's business. It's Daniel's future. It's... Clara, please don't make this harder than it already is. And Clara had said, I'm not making it harder, Mom. I'm making it possible. She had said it quietly. She had said it the way you say things when you have already made a decision and the decision is not reversible, and emotion is now simply a luxury you cannot afford. She had said it, and then she had ended the call, and she had sat alone in her apartment, in the kitchen, at the table where she used to do homework as a child when her family still lived together, and she had let herself have exactly 11 minutes of private terror before she put it away somewhere deep and locked it and went to pack a bag. That was 2 days ago. Now the car stopped in front of the cathedral, and the driver got out and opened her door without being asked, and Clara stepped out into the rain. It soaked her immediately. The silk darkened at her shoulders, her hair flattened against her neck, water ran cold fingers down the back of her neck and under the lace at her wrists. She stood on the wet stone steps of the cathedral and looked up at the carved faces above the archway. Angels or saints or something in between, worn smooth by decades of weather until their features had blurred into something more ambiguous. And she thought, this is the moment. This is where everything changes. Then she walked inside. The aisle felt like the longest distance she had ever crossed. It wasn't, objectively. She had walked longer distances in a single morning shift at the hospital, moving between wards, climbing stairs, pushing supply carts. She had run longer distances in the park on early Saturday mornings when the city was still quiet enough to pretend it was peaceful. This was perhaps 40 feet of stone floor between carved wooden pews, a distance a healthy adult could cross in under 30 seconds. It took Clara considerably longer than 30 seconds. This was partly because of the weight of the dress, which was heavier than it looked and gathered at the back in a short train that whispered against the stone with every step. It was partly because of the shoes, low-heeled by the standards of the occasion, but still unfamiliar, still demanding a particular kind of attention. It was partly because 200 pairs of eyes were tracking her movement with the intensity of people watching something they will need to describe in detail later, to people who weren't there, in quiet voices. And it was partly because at the end of the aisle, Adrian Volkov was watching her, and his expression had changed. It was subtle. She almost missed it. She might have missed it entirely if she hadn't been looking at his face with the hyper-vigilant attention of a woman trying to read every available signal from the man who was about to have legal authority over her life. But she caught it. A shift, barely visible, in the precise stillness of his features. Something in his jaw, something in the set of his eyes. A fractional softening that appeared and then disappeared so quickly she immediately began to doubt she had seen it at all. She kept walking. The priest was a pale man with careful hands who spoke in the measured tones of someone who had performed many ceremonies and understood that his role was to provide the necessary words and then get out of the way. He spoke of commitment. He spoke of partnership. He spoke of the binding nature of vows spoken in good faith. Clara stood and listened to him and felt the rain still in her hair and thought, good faith? What a particular phrase to use in this particular room. When it was time for her vows, she spoke them clearly. She had decided this, had decided it in the hotel room at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling. She would not whisper. She would not flinch. Whatever else this day took from her, it would not take her dignity. She spoke the words that were required of her in a voice that carried to the back of the cathedral, steady and unhurried. And she held Adrian Volkov's gaze while she said them, and she watched his expression with the careful attention of someone cataloging data. He watched her back. He spoke his own vows in a low, unhurried voice that was quieter than hers, but somehow more present. The voice of a man accustomed to speaking precisely what he meant, nothing more and nothing less. When he reached the part about cherishing, he paused for exactly one beat, as though the word required consideration, and then said it with a deliberateness that made several people in the front pew shift slightly in their seats. The rings were exchanged. Hers was platinum, simple, elegant, sized perfectly for her finger, in a way that felt like one more piece of information about how thoroughly this situation had been prepared for. His was plain and dark, some alloys she didn't recognize. When the priest announced that the groom could kiss the bride, Adrian Volkov looked at Clara for a long moment with an expression she could not decode, and then he reached out and took her hand, not her face, not her shoulders, her hand, and brought it briefly to his lips. A formal gesture. Precisely formal, almost archaic, the kind of gesture you might see in period films set in a different century. The assembled guests applauded with the unified relief of people who have been holding their breath and are glad to have a reason to exhale. Clara felt the warmth of his lips against her knuckles for the span of perhaps 2 seconds, and then he released her hand, and they turned together to face the cathedral, and the thing was done. The reception was held in a private room in a hotel 3 blocks from the cathedral. A room that Clara gathered had been closed to the general public for the evening at considerable expense, staffed by servers who moved with the particular efficiency of people who had been very specifically instructed in how to behave. Clara ate very little and drank 2 glasses of water and kept herself anchored near the room's periphery, watching the gathering with the clinical attention she had developed over years of working in emergency medicine, where reading a room quickly, reading the unspoken tensions, the physical cues, the conversations happening beneath conversations, was not a social skill but a survival one. What she saw was interesting. These were not primarily happy people. They were powerful people, certainly. You could see that in the way they stood, the way they moved through space with the unconscious confidence of individuals who had never had to ask permission for much. But happiness was a different animal entirely. And what she saw beneath the practiced expressions and the expensive clothing was something closer to sustained vigilance. These were people who had made their peace with living inside a certain kind of pressure, who had learned to function within it, to even thrive within it, but who never forgot. Not entirely. Not even at a wedding reception with open bars and chamber music, exactly what world they were living in. She noticed the way certain men tracked Adrian's position in the room without appearing to. She noticed the way conversations shifted subtly whenever he moved, not stopping, not pausing, but adjusting, like plants turning slightly toward or away from a light source depending on their particular nature. She noticed that no one touched him without being invited to, that even the men who appeared to be his closest associates maintained a particular physical distance that was not unfriendly but was absolutely not casual. And she noticed, when she allowed herself to look directly at him, rather than peripheral visioning him from across the room, that Adrian Volkov was not enjoying himself. He was performing, with considerable skill, the role of a man who was entirely at ease. He spoke when spoken to. He answered questions. He accepted congratulations with a nod that managed to be both gracious and dismissive simultaneously. He drank a single glass of something amber and did not refill it. He did the things that were required of him at his own wedding reception with the focused efficiency of someone completing a necessary task. But underneath the performance, there was something else, something she kept catching at the edges. A tension in his shoulders that he controlled but never quite eliminated. A flatness behind his eyes during the moments when he wasn't actively engaged in a conversation. A quality of absence in his expression when he believed no one was watching closely enough to notice. She was watching closely enough to notice. Once, across the room, he looked directly at her, just for a moment, the way your eyes move across a room and land somewhere without particular intention. But when they landed on her, they stayed. For perhaps 3 seconds, 4, before he looked away, and in those seconds she had the unsettling sensation of being seen with a thoroughness that was entirely different from being looked at. They left the reception at 10:30. The car took them north, out of the city center and into the neighborhoods where the buildings spread further apart, where the streets curved rather than running in grids, where the walls around properties were taller and the gates were more serious. Clara watched through the window and said nothing. Adrian sat across from her in the wide back seat and said nothing. The silence between them was enormous, and they both occupied it with the careful attention of people navigating a shared space in which neither was entirely certain of the rules. After perhaps 20 minutes, he spoke. "Are you all right?" She turned from the window. He was watching her with that level, unreadable expression, head slightly tilted, the question asked without particular inflection, neither warm nor cold, simply direct. "That's a complicated question," she said. "Then give me a complicated answer." She held his gaze for a moment. "I'm functional. I'm not in danger of falling apart. I understand what today was and what it means, and I have made my peace with it." She paused. "Is that the kind of complicated you were looking for?" Something moved very briefly in his expression, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. "Close enough," he said, and looked back toward his window. The car turned through a gate that opened silently ahead of them, and proceeded up a private drive lined with old trees that arched overhead in the headlights, and Clara got her first look at the place that was, apparently, now her home. It was not what she had expected. She had prepared herself for something ostentatious, something that announced itself aggressively, all marble and gold fixtures, and the architectural equivalent of someone standing in a room clearing their throat until everyone looked. That was how she had imagined the home of a man like Adrian Volkov, everything chosen to project authority, to remind anyone who walked inside of who owned this space and what that ownership meant. What she found instead was a house that was large. Yes, undeniably large. 3 stories of pale stone behind glass and steel and carefully maintained grounds, but quiet about it. The interior, when they stepped inside and the lights came on gradually, as though the house was waking slowly from sleep, was full of clean lines and high ceilings, and an absence of clutter that felt deliberate rather than cold. There were books, actual books, not decorative books, books with broken spines and pages that had been turned, stacked on shelves, that ran floor to ceiling in the room she could see through a doorway to the left. There were lights that someone had set to a low amber warmth before they arrived. There was a staircase of dark wood that curved upward to the second floor. It looked, unsettlingly, like a place where someone actually lived. A woman appeared from the back of the house, perhaps 60, compact, with the efficient movement of someone who had kept large spaces running for a very long time. She introduced herself as Mrs. Hartley, the house manager, and she said this in a tone that communicated welcome without sycophancy, which Clara found immediately refreshing. "I'll show you to your rooms," Adrian said. Rooms, plural. Clara noted that. She followed him up the staircase to the second floor and down a wide hallway lined with more books and one large painting. Abstract, blue and gray and very still, like looking into deep water, to a door at the end. "This is yours," he said, and opened it. The room was large, with windows that looked out over the back of the property, where trees rose black against the rain-heavy sky. There was a bed dressed in white and gray, a desk, a reading chair, a bathroom. She could see through a half-open door with a clawfoot tub that surprised her. Someone had arranged fresh flowers on the nightstand, white and small, nothing showy, and set a glass of water beside them. "My room is there," Adrian said, gesturing toward the opposite end of the hallway. At the other end, Clara looked at him. "I want to be clear about something," he said. His voice was the same, controlled, precise, giving nothing away that he hadn't chosen to give, but there was something beneath it, something she couldn't quite name. "This marriage is real in the legal sense. In every other sense, it is whatever you decide to make it." He paused. "Your room, your space. I will not enter without being invited. I will not make demands of any kind that you haven't agreed to. You have freedom of movement within the property and with appropriate security arrangements outside of it." Another pause. "You are not a prisoner here, Clara." She had been braced for many things. She had been braced for possessiveness, for the assumption of entitlement that came with the exchange that had been made, for cruelty that dressed itself in the language of rationality. She had not been braced for this. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because you should know it," he said simply. Then he turned and walked back down the hallway toward his own room, and she stood in the doorway of hers and watched him go and felt the ground she had prepared to stand on shift in ways she hadn't anticipated. She couldn't sleep. This was not surprising. She lay in the white and gray bed in the room at the end of the hall in the house of a man she had married 7 hours ago, and she stared at the ceiling and listened to the rain against the windows and tried to locate the architecture of her new reality. She was trained in emergency medicine. She had been trained to stay functional under pressure, to process information quickly, to make decisions with incomplete data and be willing to revise them as more became available. She had sat across from grieving families in waiting rooms and told them things that broke their worlds apart. She had worked back-to-back shifts on nights when the hospital was understaffed and the cases were bad and the margins were thin and adrenaline was the only thing keeping her standing. She was, by most measures, not a woman who fell apart easily. But this was a different kind of pressure. This was not a situation she could diagnose and treat and discharge. This was a situation she was living inside, with no known discharge criteria and no protocol for what came next. She thought about what he had said. "You are not a prisoner here." She thought about his expression when she walked down the aisle, the fractional shift she had caught and then doubted. She thought, who is this man? Not the version that his reputation described, the one she had been briefed on in terse, careful language by the intermediary who had arranged the terms of the marriage, the one that lived in the whispered conversations of the people at the reception, the one that existed in the city's particular mythology of itself. Not the boogeyman, not the monster, but the actual person who had been standing in that cathedral in the rain waiting for her, who had brought her hand to his lips and not her face, who had given her a room at the opposite end of his house and told her it was hers. She didn't have an answer. She wasn't sure she had enough data yet. She got out of bed at 2 a.m. and walked barefoot out of her room and down the hallway, quietly, though the floors barely creaked, and down the stairs and into the kitchen, because she needed water and possibly something to eat, and because she was restless in a way that stillness couldn't accommodate. The kitchen was large and clean and better equipped than anything she'd had in her apartment, with a long stone counter and windows over the sink that looked out into the dark garden. She filled a glass from the tap and stood at the counter and drank it slowly, and she was halfway through a second glass when she heard a sound from the room adjacent to the kitchen, a room she hadn't yet explored, one of the many doors she had filed away for later, and she went still. The sound came again, low, controlled but effortful. A sharp exhale through the nose, the kind you make when you are trying not to make a sound that costs you something. She set down her glass. She went to the door and pushed it open. It was a study of some kind. Shelves, a large desk, a leather chair. Adrian Volkov was in the leather chair, his jacket gone, his shirt open at the collar, and his left hand pressed against his right side in the way that a person presses their hand against something that hurts when they stop paying close enough attention to it. He looked up when she entered. His expression went through several things in rapid succession. Surprise, which resolved into blankness, which then resolved into something more complicated that she didn't have time to classify because she was already moving across the room. "Move your hand," she said. "Clara, I'm a nurse practitioner. Move your hand." He held her gaze for a moment, and then he moved his hand. The wound was on his right side beneath his ribs, partially obscured by the shirt he hadn't taken off. She pushed the fabric aside and looked at it with the clinical attention she kept in a separate part of herself for exactly these situations, the part that processed what it saw without the emotional overlay. And what she saw was a wound that had been treated. Someone had cleaned it and closed it with several sutures. But that was bleeding again, one of the sutures having pulled, probably during movement that it shouldn't have been subjected to. "When did this happen?" she said. 3 days ago." "Who sutured it?" "My doctor." "Your doctor did an adequate job. You have been moving in ways you were told not to." She looked up at him. He was watching her with an expression of someone who has decided to let something happen that they would normally prevent, and she couldn't tell if that was because he had decided to trust her or because he simply didn't have the energy left to argue. "I need supplies. Is there a medical kit in this house?" "Cabinet above the refrigerator." She went back to the kitchen, found the kit. Comprehensive, professionally stocked, the kind you ordered rather than bought from a pharmacy, and brought it back. She worked in the light of the desk lamp, quietly and efficiently, cleaning and re-securing the suture and applying a fresh dressing, while Adrian sat entirely still in the leather chair and let her do it. When she was done, she sat back and looked at him. "Thank you," he said, quietly, without performative weight, just the straightforward delivery of a fact. "You're welcome," she paused. "You should have woken someone." "I didn't want to wake anyone." Macho stubbornness or actual preference for suffering alone? Something shifted in his expression again, that almost not quite amusement. "The latter, generally speaking. That's a bad habit. I've been told." She gathered the supplies and stood. She was suddenly aware of how she was dressed, a loose sleep shirt and shorts, barefoot, in the study of a man she had known for approximately 1 day. And she was aware of how he looked, wounded and still, and watching her with those eyes that gave very little away and somehow still communicated more than he probably intended. "Get some sleep," she said. "Don't move around tonight." "Yes," he said. And then just as she reached the door, "Clara," she stopped. "I know what today cost you," he said. His voice was the same, controlled, precise, but there was something underneath it now, something she hadn't heard before, something with weight and texture. "I know what I asked of your family. I know what it meant for you to agree." A pause. "I am not unaware of that." She stood with her hand on the door frame, and she didn't turn around, and she said, "I know you're not." She didn't know why she said it. She hadn't planned to. It came out of some part of her that had been watching and collecting data all day. From the cathedral to the reception to the room at the end of the hall, to this moment right now. And had arrived, quietly and without fanfare, at a provisional conclusion about what kind of man was sitting in this chair. Then she went back to her room and lay down in the dark. And this time, eventually, she slept. Morning arrived gray and damp, the rain still present but reduced to a fine mist that turned the trees beyond the window into soft suggestions of themselves. Clara was up early. Her body was unreliable about sleeping in on any day, let alone the first morning in an entirely unfamiliar place, and she dressed in the clothes she'd brought in the bag she'd packed in her apartment what felt like a very long time ago, and she went downstairs. Mrs. Hartley was already in the kitchen. There was coffee, and there was breakfast, and there was the quiet efficiency of a house that had been operating on a particular rhythm for a long time, and was simply absorbing her presence into it without making a production of the adjustment. "Mr. Volkov's already been down," Mrs. Hartley said, in the tone of someone conveying useful information without editorializing. "He went out about an hour ago." Clara poured herself coffee and sat at the long kitchen table and thought about the night before. The study, the wound, the particular quiet of him in the chair. "I know what today cost you." She sat with that for a while. She was a practical woman. She had always been a practical woman, even as a child, even in circumstances that had called loudly for something more dramatic than practicality. She believed in evidence. She believed in what she could observe and verify. She believed in building understanding incrementally, from data, rather than from the stories she told herself about situations before the evidence was in. The evidence so far was limited. 1 day. 1 night. A room at the opposite end of a hallway, and a wound that needed redressing, and a man who said thank you like he meant it, and "I know what today cost you," like the knowledge was something he had been carrying for a while. It was not enough data to build anything on. It was not enough data to trust. But it was, she allowed, enough data to keep watching, enough to reserve judgment, enough to walk into whatever came next with her eyes open rather than her mind made up. She finished her coffee and went to find the room with all the books and sat down in front of the shelves and pulled out the first one that caught her eye. Outside, the mist continued its quiet revision of the world. Somewhere across the city, in offices and kitchens and back rooms, people who knew Adrian Volkov's name whispered it to each other and thought they understood what it meant. None of them were in this house. None of them had seen the study, the chair, the careful distance of a man who gave someone he'd married a room at the opposite end of his home and called it hers. None of them had watched him say thank you like the word meant something. Clara sat with the book open in her lap and the rain soft against the windows and thought, I don't know who you are yet, Adrian Volkov, but I am going to find out. 3 days passed before Clara saw Adrian Volkov at anything resembling close range again. He was present in the house. She could feel the fact of his presence the way you feel weather before it arrives. A slight shift in atmospheric pressure, a change in the way rooms felt when she walked through them shortly after he had been there. His coffee cup in the kitchen sink. A book moved from where she had left it on the shelf, replaced at a different angle. The faint sound of his voice, low and even, carrying through a closed door from somewhere on the ground floor in the evenings when she was already upstairs. He existed in the house the way a tide exists, consistently, powerfully, and at a careful distance from the shore. She found this more unsettling than his direct presence would have been. She had prepared herself for proximity, for the particular discomfort of sharing space with someone she didn't know and hadn't chosen. She had not prepared herself for this, for a man who occupied the same building as her and still managed to make himself largely absent, who seemed to have calculated exactly how much space she needed and was giving it to her with a precision that felt almost architectural. On the fourth morning, she came downstairs at 7 to find him already at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a folder of documents he was reading with the focused attention of someone who was accustomed to consuming large amounts of information before most people were awake. He looked up when she came in. He said good morning. She said good morning back. She poured herself coffee and sat across the table, and they occupied the same silence for perhaps 15 minutes, while she looked at the garden through the window and he worked through whatever was in the folder. And it was not comfortable exactly, but it was not unbearable either. It was, she thought, the silence of two people who had decided, separately and without discussion, that they were going to try to be civilized about this. When he closed the folder and stood to leave, she said, "How's the wound?" He paused. "Better. You should let me check the suture today." A beat. "All right. After dinner," she said. "Don't move around too much before then." He looked at her with that expression she was beginning to catalog, the one that existed just at the edges of something she couldn't quite name, occupying the narrow space between assessment and something warmer. "I have a meeting at 9, he said. "I'll be careful." That wasn't a yes or no answer. "No," he agreed. It wasn't. And he picked up the folder and left. She sat with her coffee and the garden and thought, progress. Marginal, ambiguous, probably meaningless, but progress. She was learning him, she realized, the way you learn a language you have never formally studied. Not through instruction, not through a curriculum, but through exposure and attention and the gradual accumulation of small observations that eventually, if you are patient enough, begin to resolve themselves into patterns. She had been trained to do this. Emergency medicine demanded it. The ability to read what was not being said, to hear what was beneath the words, to watch the physical language of a person and understand what the verbal language was not telling you. She watched Adrian Volkov, and she built her understanding carefully, piece by piece. He was, she determined, a man of extraordinary discipline. Not the performance of discipline, not the studied, deliberate self-control of someone managing an image, but the internalized, habitual discipline of a person who had been practicing it for so long that it had become structural, as much a part of his architecture as bone. He ate at specific times. He slept, she gathered from the rhythms of the house, in a pattern that prioritized early mornings. He worked constantly, not with the frantic energy of someone who didn't know how to stop, but with the quiet, sustained focus of someone for whom work was simply the condition of being conscious. He didn't drink more than a single glass of anything in the evenings. He didn't raise his voice. In the entire first week, she never once heard him raise his voice. She had expected him, she realized, to perform his power, to wear it visibly, to use it as atmosphere, to let it function as the constant background music of their shared space. What she found instead was a man who kept his power so entirely contained that the only evidence of it, most of the time, was the behavior of everyone around him. The careful way Mrs. Hartley gave him his morning schedule, the tone of the phone calls she could hear fragments of through closed doors, the particular quality of attention she observed from the two men who were always, at a discreet distance, somewhere on the property. She had been given freedom of movement within the house and grounds, as he had promised. She had also been told, quietly, by a man named Reeves, steady-eyed, plainly dressed, who seemed to occupy a role somewhere between assistant and security, that when she wished to go outside the property, she only needed to let him know and arrangements would be made. She had tested this on the 5th day, asking to go to a pharmacy 3 miles away. Reeves had driven her himself, waited outside without following her in, and driven her back. No commentary. No reporting to anyone as far as she could tell. Just a quiet extension of exactly the freedom she had been promised. She was trying not to be disarmed by this. She was trying very hard. On the 7th night, she went to find him for the suture check she had requested. He had, in fact, come to her the evening before for the first one, appearing at the door of her room and knocking twice before entering, standing with the slightly compressed patience of a man who found physical vulnerability uncomfortable but was tolerating it. And she knocked on the study door and heard his voice say, "Come in," and she entered to find him standing at the window with his back to her and a phone at his ear, speaking in a low voice that stopped when she appeared. He said something into the phone in Russian, 2 words, clipped, and ended the call. "Sorry," she said. "I can come back." "No." He turned from the window. He was in a dark sweater and trousers, no jacket, and he looked tired in a way she hadn't seen before. Not physically depleted, but somewhere deeper. The weariness of sustained vigilance that has gone on for too long without adequate rest. "It's fine. Come in." She went through the familiar routine, had him lift the sweater enough to access the dressing, check the suture, replace the dressing with practiced efficiency. He stood and let her work in silence, looking somewhere above her head, and she was aware again, as she had been in the same study a week ago, of being in very close physical proximity to a person she still did not fully understand. "It's healing well," she said, stepping back. "Another week, and the suture can probably come out." "Thank you." "Can I ask what happened?" He lowered the sweater. He looked at her for a moment in that assessing way. "Business complication." "A business complication that involves getting shot." "Not an uncommon kind in my line of work." She held his gaze. "Does it happen often?" "Less often than it used to." He said it without apology, without drama, simply as information. "I have better people around me now than I did when I was younger." "How young were you when it first happened?" Something shifted in his expression. He looked at her as though recalibrating something, adjusting for a question he hadn't expected. 23, he said. "What was the circumstances?" "Clara." His voice was gentle, which surprised her. Not the warning in it, but the gentleness. "Some questions I'll answer. Some I won't. Not because I'm hiding something from you specifically, but because there are things about my work that it's safer for you not to know in detail." She considered this. "That's a reasonable answer," she said. "You sound surprised." "I am, a little." "Why?" She thought about it honestly. "Because I had a version of you in my head before I met you," she said. "A version built from other people's descriptions. And the version I'm actually encountering keeps not matching it." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the city hummed its distant, indifferent hum. Then he said, "What version did you have?" "Someone who would use marriage as a mechanism of control. Who would mistake legal authority for actual authority over a person?" She paused. "Someone who would be very different from who you appear to be." He was very still. Not the stillness of someone suppressing a reaction, but the stillness of someone who is genuinely listening, who has heard something that requires processing rather than reflexive response. "Appearances aren't always reliable indicators," he said finally, "in either direction." "No," she agreed, "they're not." She left the study and went back to her room, and she lay in the dark and thought about the way he had said appearances aren't always reliable indicators in either direction, and she thought about what that might mean, and she decided she needed more data before she could build anything meaningful from it. She needed more time. She needed to keep watching. She was not, she discovered, averse to that prospect. And that perhaps was the most unsettling thing of all. The second week was different from the first in ways that were incremental, and then suddenly weren't. Breakfast became a shared event rather than an accidental one. Not by discussion. They never actually discussed it, which was somehow more comfortable than if they had, because it removed the slight awkwardness of a formal negotiation about something as simple as morning coffee. He was there, she came down, they occupied the kitchen in the way they had on that fourth morning, with a silence that had evolved from the edged quiet of two strangers to something that had slightly more give in it, slightly more room to breathe. He asked her questions sometimes. Careful ones, the kind that gave her space to answer as much or as little as she chose. She had been a nurse practitioner for 4 years, he knew that. The same intermediary who had arranged the terms of the marriage had presumably provided him with at least a basic biography. But he asked about the work itself, the texture of it, what it required and what it gave back, in a way that made her understand he was interested in the answer, rather than performing interest to fill silence. She told him about the emergency department, about the particular intensity of that specific kind of medical work, where the cases came in random and urgent and you had to be able to pivot completely, sometimes mid-thought, from one crisis to another. About the patients she remembered most clearly, not always the dramatic ones, sometimes the quiet ones, the ones who came in frightened and alone and needed someone to simply be steady for them before anything else. He listened to all of it without interrupting. "You like the work?" he said one morning. Not a question. "I love it," she said. "I was very good at it." He caught the past tense. She saw him catch it. "You'll go back," he said. "When things are settled, if that's what you want." She looked at him carefully. "Is that something you're offering or something you're assuming?" "Both," he said. She looked back at her coffee. "You keep doing that," she said. "Doing what?" "Saying things that make it harder to maintain a straightforward, uncomplicated position about this situation." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Is a straightforward, uncomplicated position what you're trying to maintain?" "I was trying to." "And now?" She looked up at him. He was watching her with that expression, the one she still hadn't fully mapped, the one that lived at the intersection of careful restraint and something that wasn't carefully restrained at all. "Now, I'm not sure it's possible," she said honestly. "You're not who I thought you'd be. I'm trying to figure out who you actually are." He didn't say anything to that. He just held her gaze for a long moment, and then he nodded once, slowly, like someone receiving information they needed to sit with, and he picked up his coffee and looked at the garden, and she did the same, and the silence between them settled into something that felt, for the first time, like it had warmth in it. She thought, well, there it is. She was in trouble, of a very specific and entirely unexpected kind. It was on a Thursday evening in the third week that the shape of things shifted considerably. She had spent the afternoon in the library. She had taken to calling the book room the library because it functioned as one, working through a medical journal she'd found on the shelf that was more current than she'd expected, making notes in the margin with the pencil she'd found in a cup on the desk. She was comfortable there. The room was quiet, and the light was good, and the chair was the right kind of deep. And there was something grounding about doing something familiar, reading, taking notes, thinking in the language of the work she had been trained for, in the midst of circumstances that were anything but. She heard voices in the hallway, not unusual. There were often people moving through the house during the day, quiet and purposeful, the infrastructure of whatever Adrian ran existing mostly at a remove she didn't try to approach. But these voices were sharper than usual, not raised, but carrying an edge that cut through the closed library door, and she heard Adrian's voice among them, saying something in a low, clipped tone that she had not heard him use before, and then another voice, male, younger, higher-pitched, with something she recognized even muffled through a door as controlled panic. She set down the journal. She didn't open the door. That was not her situation to enter, but she sat very still, and she listened, and she couldn't make out the words, only the shapes of them, the back and forth of a conversation that was dense with consequence, the kind of conversation where what was not being said occupied as much space as what was. Then the voices moved away, down the hall toward the back of the house, and she let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. 40 minutes later, Adrian came into the library. He didn't announce himself. He knocked once, which she had come to understand was his version of a considerable courtesy, and then he opened the door and stood in the frame. He was in his jacket, and his expression was fully composed, every available surface of his face presenting its accustomed blankness. But she had been watching him long enough now to see beneath the surface, and what she saw beneath it was a tightly contained version of the weight she had seen in his study on that first night. "I need to be out of the house for the next few days," he said. "I wanted to tell you directly. Is everything all right?" He held her gaze. "There are situations in my work that require personal attention periodically. This is one of them." A pause. "You'll be fine here. Reeves will be here if you need anything." "Adrian." She said his name without thinking, and it stopped him, and she was mildly startled herself by how naturally it came out, how it had traveled from the formal distance of Mr. Volkov, which she had used in her head, though never aloud, to simply Adrian without her noticing the journey. "I'm not asking because I'm worried about myself. I'm asking because you look like a man who is about to walk into something genuinely dangerous." He looked at her for a long moment. "I'll be fine," he said. It was not the hollow reassurance of someone saying the expected thing. It was quieter than that, and more considered, and somehow that made it harder to dismiss. "I have been in dangerous situations before, and I have always come back. That record holds." That's a terrible statistical argument. Your sample size is too small, and you're too deep into the run for prior performance to guarantee future results. Something moved through his eyes. It arrived and disappeared so quickly, she wasn't certain it had been there. But if she had to name it, she would have called it wonder, or the edge of it. "You're right," he said. "Technically." "Come back," she said. It came out more plainly than she intended, more direct. But she didn't take it back. He stood very still for a moment. "I intend to," he said. And then he left. She sat in the library for a long time after she heard the front door close, with the medical journal open and unread in her lap, and she thought about what was happening to her equilibrium and whether there was any meaningful action she could take to stabilize it, and she concluded that there was not, and that this was possibly the most alarming domestic situation she had ever found herself in, which was saying something considerable given the circumstances under which she had arrived here. He was gone for 3 days. She functioned well. She had always functioned well in the absence of things she was accustomed to. Adaptation was one of her core competencies, practically a professional requirement. She read. She walked in the garden in the mornings when the weather permitted. She had a long and surprisingly easy conversation with Mrs. Hartley about the house's kitchen garden and the particular stubbornness of late-season tomatoes. She called her mother once, a brief call, controlled and careful and full of the things neither of them said. Her mother asked if she was all right. She said yes. Her mother asked, tentatively, like someone testing ice, if she had been treated well. She paused before answering, which was itself an answer of a kind, and said, "Yes, I have been treated well," and meant it, which was a thing she had not entirely predicted. She didn't tell her mother about the suture in the study, or the breakfast conversations, or the way he said "I intend to" when she told him to come back. Some things were not ready to be translated yet. Some things were still too new and too ambiguously shaped to survive the process of being put into words for someone else. He came back on a Thursday evening, and she heard the door and then his voice in the entry hallway speaking briefly to Reeves, and she was in the kitchen, and she stayed there and didn't go into the hall because she was making a principled stand against whatever her instincts were suggesting she do. And approximately 4 minutes later, he came into the kitchen, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "You're back," she said finally. "I said I would be." "You did." She looked at him more carefully. He was tired, visibly this time, the deep tiredness he usually kept concealed sitting closer to the surface than usual. "Sit down." "Clara, sit down," she said. "I'm making tea. If you argue with me about it, I'll pour it in the sink, and you can stand there feeling foolish." He sat down. She made tea with the particular focused attention of someone choosing to do a small thing very well, because it was the small things, she had always believed, that held the structure of larger ones together. She set a cup in front of him and sat across the table and watched him wrap both hands around it. "Was it as bad as it looked like it was going to be?" she asked. He considered the question with more seriousness than she might have expected. "It was manageable," he said. "There were components of it I would have preferred to avoid. The outcome was acceptable." "Are you hurt?" "No." She looked at him. "I'm not hurt," he said, and the way he said it carried enough specificity to be credible. "Tired. There's a difference." "I know the difference," she said. "I know what hurt looks like." "Yes," he said. "You do." He looked at her across the table, in the warm light of the kitchen, with the tea steaming between his hands, and something in his expression was different than it had been before he left. Softer, not in a way that made him seem less formidable, but in a way that made him seem more present, more there, as though some piece of armor had been deliberately set aside. "I thought about what you said," he said. "I said several things. You said come back." He held her gaze. "It was in my mind, more than once." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the city maintained its ordinary hum, traffic, the distant percussion of the world going about its business. In the kitchen, Clara Bennett sat across the table from the man she had married against her choice, and looked at him saying it was in my mind more than once, and felt the architecture of what she had been constructing. The careful distance, the provisional conclusions, the principled separation between observation and feeling, flex significantly. "Good," she said. Her voice was steady. "It was supposed to be." He held her gaze for a moment longer, and then he looked down at his tea, and she looked at hers, and they sat together in the kitchen while the evening settled around the house. And it was not uncomplicated, and it was not simple, and she could not have said with any confidence what it was exactly, only that it was real in a way that very few things in the last several weeks had managed to be. She had arrived here in a wedding dress that felt like chains and a heart made of deliberate practicality, and something was happening that her practicality had not prepared adequate models for. Something was cracking open, not breaking, not failing, but opening, the way cold things open in early warmth, slowly, with resistance, and then all at once with a feeling that is indistinguishable from relief. She picked up her tea. He picked up his. The house was quiet around them, and the night came in gently from the windows, and for the first time since she had walked through that door in a soaked wedding dress that weighed more than she did, Clara Bennett felt something she had not expected to feel here, in this house, with this man. She felt, without quite meaning to, at home, which was, of course, when things got considerably more complicated. It was Reeves who found her in the library 2 days later, appearing in the doorway with his characteristic quiet knock, and said that there were visitors at the gate who had given her name, not Adrian's, specifically hers, and asked to see her. 2 men she didn't recognize. No appointment. No advance notice. Reeves's expression was composed, but she had been watching this household long enough to read the slight tension beneath the surface of it, the professional alertness that was something other than his baseline. "Did they say who they were?" she asked. "They said they were old friends of your family," Reeves said. "However, I have not been able to verify that, and their vehicle's registration came back to a company I don't recognize." Clara set down her journal. She looked at Reeves and thought about what that meant. Not in the abstract, not as a generic security concern, but specifically in the context of this house, this marriage, this particular web of entanglements that she had walked into with her eyes only partially open. "Does Adrian know?" she asked. "He's being notified now," Reeves said. "But I wanted to inform you directly, given that they asked for you by name." She stood up. "Don't let them in," she said. "I wasn't going to," Reeves said. Adrian appeared at the library door 4 minutes later. She had timed it without meaning to, some internal clock that had started running the moment Reeves had appeared. He was in the shirt and trousers of a working afternoon, and his expression was the fully composed version, every available surface sealed. He looked at her first, which she noticed, not at Reeves, at her, as though the first thing he needed to assess was whether she was all right. "I'm fine," she said, before he could ask. "I know you are." He looked at Reeves. Description. Reeves gave it. 2 men, late 30s to mid-40s, one with a scar along the jaw. Adrian's expression didn't change, but she felt the room change, the way temperature changes before a storm. Not dramatic, not sudden, but absolutely perceptible to anyone paying attention. "Do you know who they are?" she asked. He looked at her. A pause that was precisely long enough to be a decision. "Yes," he said. "And they are not friends of your family. They are people who want something they believe they can reach through you." "Through me," she repeated. "Why through me?" "Because they think you're a point of leverage." His voice was even, steady. A doctor voice, she thought. The voice of someone delivering a diagnosis with the specific kind of composure that is designed to keep the room functional. "They believe that threatening what I care about is an effective strategy." The room was very quiet. "What you care about," she said carefully. He held her gaze. "Yes," he said. She stood in the library, in the afternoon light, with the medical journal still open on the chair behind her, and she looked at Adrian Volkov, and she understood that something had been named, not for her benefit, not performatively, but simply because the situation required the truth of it to be spoken aloud, and he had chosen not to hedge it. He cared about her. He had made that clear to people who existed in his world with enough clarity that they had identified her as a means to reach him. He was now telling her this directly because she had the right to know it. "What happens now?" she said. "Now," he said, "I deal with it." "And me?" "You stay close to the house for the next few days. I'm sorry to ask that of you." "Don't be sorry," she said. "Just be careful." He looked at her for one long moment, the same moment, she thought, as the one they'd had over tea 2 evenings ago, the one that kept recurring between them like a phrase in music that the piece needed to return to, a motif that was becoming the shape of something larger. Then he nodded, and he was already moving, and the house shifted around him into its other register, the one she had glimpsed in fragments, the one that was organized and purposeful and very serious. And Clara stood in the library and felt the shape of things clarify around her like an image coming into focus. She had married this man as a sacrifice. She had walked into this house prepared to survive it. She had expected control, possession, the particular cruelty of power exercised simply because it could be. What she had found instead was a man who gave her a room at the end of a hallway and called it hers, who sat across from her at breakfast and asked questions because he wanted the answers, who said "I intend to" when she told him to come back, who came into a library in an ordinary afternoon to tell her the truth about who those men were because she had the right to know. And now she was standing in that same library, understanding that the world beyond this house had already decided she mattered to him, which meant the world beyond this house already saw her as something worth using. She picked up the medical journal. She sat back down in the chair. She read, or tried to, because doing something familiar and grounding was what she did when the ground was uncertain. Outside, she heard the front gate close. Inside, the house was very quiet, and she was alone with the growing and inconvenient understanding that she was not, and had not been for some time, as indifferent to Adrian Volkov as the woman who had walked down that rain-soaked aisle had planned to be. The men at the gate did not come back that day, or the next, but their absence was not the same as their disappearance, and Clara understood the difference. She had worked long enough in emergency medicine to know that the absence of visible symptoms was not the same as the absence of a condition, that sometimes the most dangerous things were the ones that had gone quiet, that had learned to wait. She stayed close to the house as Adrian had asked. She did not experience this as confinement, which surprised her slightly. She had expected to feel it that way, the old instinct toward autonomy pushing back against any external limit, the particular restlessness of a person who had built her independence carefully over years as a matter of survival. But the house was large and the grounds were generous, and there was, she had discovered, a small greenhouse at the back of the property that Mrs. Hartley had given her a key to without being asked on the second day of the self-imposed stay, simply placing the key on the kitchen table beside her morning coffee, with a nod that communicated everything and required nothing. Clara spent her afternoons in the greenhouse. It was warm in there, even in the cooling weeks of early autumn, and smelled of green things and damp earth and the particular clean smell of growing that she had not encountered in any significant quantity since her grandmother's yard when she was a child. She didn't know very much about plants, but she was good at learning things. And there were books. Of course, there were books. This entire property seemed to run on a quiet abundance of books. And she began to learn the language of the greenhouse's existing inhabitants, the way she had been learning everything else about this place. Carefully, incrementally, with attention. It was in the greenhouse, on the third afternoon of the quiet confinement, that Adrian found her. She heard the door and looked up from the small terracotta pot she was repotting. Mrs. Hartley had suggested this particular project, and she had undertaken it with the focused commitment she brought to everything she decided to do. And he was standing in the doorway in a jacket and open collar, looking at her with an expression she had begun to associate with the moments when he came to find her specifically, rather than encountering her in the general course of the house's routine. There was something more deliberate about it, more considered. "Mrs. Hartley said you were out here," he said. "She's been lending me the greenhouse," Clara said. "I hope that's all right." "It's completely all right." He stepped inside, glancing at the rows of plants with mild interest. I don't come out here enough. It's mostly her project. She's very good at it. Clara set down the pot and looked at him. What's happened? He looked at her with something that might have been mild surprise. At the directness of it, perhaps, or at the accuracy of her read that something had happened when she had no visible evidence to work from. But she had been watching him long enough now to know the difference between the version of him that came to find her to make conversation and the version that came to find her because he needed to say something that mattered. The two men from the gate, he said. I've identified their organization. It's a group called the Markov Network. They've been operating in the eastern districts for about 3 years, building towards something that would require them to move against my operations. And they chose me as a pressure point. Yes. He said it without softening it, which she had come to understand was one of his consistent qualities. He did not soften things she was capable of receiving directly. I need you to understand the full scope of the situation, not the sanitized version, the actual one. Tell me the actual one, she said. He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet before saying something he had been deciding whether to say. Then he crossed the greenhouse and sat on the wooden bench that ran along the back wall, and the posture of it, sitting rather than standing, the particular physical signal of someone choosing to be less defended, told her something about what was coming before the words did. There is a reason the Markov Network identified you specifically, he said. Not just as my wife, as someone I would find difficult to use as a calculation. What does that mean? He looked at her steadily. In my world, the way you protect something is to demonstrate that the cost of threatening it exceeds the potential benefit. That is a rational calculation, but cold, functional, and effective. It means that whatever you care about, you cannot allow others to see that you care about it too clearly, or you hand them a weapon. I know that logic, she said quietly. The Markov Network knows it too, and they have assessed, correctly, that my usual ability to make that calculation dispassionately does not apply to you. He paused. They are not wrong about that. The greenhouse was very quiet. Outside, the garden made its small seasonal sounds. Wind in the remaining leaves, the distant song of something in the trees at the property's edge. Inside, the air was warm and green and close, and Clara sat with her hands in her lap and her heart doing something complicated and looked at Adrian Volkov telling her, with the careful precision of a man who dealt in information and understood its weight, that she was not a calculation to him. How long has that been true? She asked. He held her gaze. Longer than you know, he said. She let that sit for a moment. Adrian? Yes. That is the second time you have said something that strongly implies there is a larger context I'm not aware of. The first time I let it pass because I didn't have enough ground to stand on to ask the question properly. She kept her voice even, kept the clinical part of herself engaged, because the clinical part was what kept her functional when the ground shifted. I'm asking it properly now. He was quiet for a long moment. Not the silence of evasion. She had learned to read his silences well enough for that. This was the silence of a person arriving at a threshold and deciding, with full awareness of what the decision meant, to cross it. Do you remember, he said slowly, approximately 10 years ago, when you were still in your second year of nursing school? There was an incident in the parking structure off Meridian Avenue, late October, around midnight. She looked at him. The memory came to her gradually, the way old memories do. Not in a rush, but in layers, assembling itself from fragments she hadn't consciously held in years, but that had clearly been stored somewhere accessible. The parking structure. Late October. She had been walking to her car after a long study night, the kind that stretched past 11 and left your eyes grainy and your thinking slightly blurred. A man on the ground near the stairwell. She had almost walked past him because the light was bad and her mind was still running through pharmacology notes. And then something in the way he was lying had resolved into wrongness, and she had stopped. There was a man, she said slowly. He'd been hurt. I wasn't sure if it was an accident or... It wasn't an accident, Adrian said. She looked at him. Something in his expression had shifted, not away from control but through it, to something that was underneath the control and had been there the whole time and was now simply not being hidden. Something that was old and quiet and had been carried for a very long time. That was you, she said. It was not a question. She said it the way you say something when the evidence assembles itself into a shape that can only be one thing, when the conclusion arrives not as a surprise, but as the completion of a pattern you have been accumulating data for without knowing it. That was me, he said. The greenhouse held its warm green silence. She thought about that night. She had been 23, barely. Her birthday was in September, and this was October. She had found a man in a parking structure with 2 wounds, one to his side and one to his shoulder, conscious but losing ground fast. And she had done what she had been trained to do. Assessed the situation, applied pressure, called for help, stayed with him, talked to him in the even, calm voice she had practiced in her training, because the voice of the person beside you mattered, because the sound of another person staying present kept something vital engaged. She had held her jacket against his side and talked to him about nothing in particular, about the pharmacology notes she'd been reviewing, about the coffee she'd been planning to get on the way home, about a film she'd seen the week before, until the ambulance came. She had not seen his face clearly. The light was bad and she had been focused on the wounds. She had answered the paramedics' questions, and then she had gone home, and she had not thought about it, not consciously, not often. It had become one of those nights that belonged to the accumulating archive of her training, evidence of the person she was becoming, a data point rather than a story. But he had seen her face, and he had remembered it, and he had carried it for 10 years. "You were drifting," she said quietly. "I remember. I talked to keep you present." I remember everything you said," he said. She let out a breath. "That was not the first time I had been in a dangerous situation," Adrian said, his voice steady but quieter now, stripped of its usual professional surface down to something more fundamental underneath. "But it was the first time someone stayed. Not because they were paid to. Not because there was a calculation involved, because it was the right thing to do and you did it." A pause. "You were 23 years old and you sat on a concrete floor in a parking structure and held your jacket against a stranger's wounds and told him about a film you'd seen. You didn't know who he was. You didn't know what he was. You just stayed." Clara looked at her hands in her lap. "I didn't leave because leaving wasn't something I could do," she said. "Not in that situation." "I know. That's the point." He looked at her with that expression, the fully unguarded version she had only glimpsed in fragments before, briefly, and always from the edges. Now it was simply there, directed at her, unprotected and entirely clear. "That is who you are. That has always been who you are. And I never forgot it." She was quiet for a long moment. "The debts," she said. "My father's business. The threats that appeared and then disappeared." She was thinking aloud, assembling it the way she assembled a differential diagnosis, and she could feel the shape of it forming. "Those weren't coincidences." "No," he said simply. "You were involved." "Yes." "For how long?" He held her gaze without flinching. 7 years. 7 years. She sat with the magnitude of that number. Not in anger, not yet, because she was still in the assembling phase, the information gathering phase, the phase where emotional response had to wait behind comprehension. 7 years was not a passing thought. 7 years was architecture. 7 years was a sustained, deliberate structure built around her life with her having no knowledge of it. "Tell me," she said. "Everything." He did. He told her about the first time he had tracked down her name. Through the hospital that had treated him that night, through records he had no legitimate access to and had obtained anyway, because he was even then a man with the infrastructure to obtain things he needed. He told her how he had watched at first in the entirely detached way of someone cataloging a debt. He had believed in debts, in that time of his life, more than he had believed in most other things. She had done something for him and he owed her something and he would pay it. But payment, as it turned out, was not a simple transaction when the person you owed was a 23-year-old nursing student who went to class 6 days a week and studied in the library until they threw her out and worked a weekend shift at a coffee shop and sent money home to her parents despite having very little to spare. He had made the first intervention when a loan her father had taken from a company with genuinely dangerous intentions had come due in a way that was going to be very bad for her family. He had resolved the situation from a distance and told himself it was the debt, just the debt, a balance being cleared. He told her about the second time. And the third. He told her about the man who had been watching her commute home from a night shift 3 years later, about the way he had become aware of this and what had been done about it in terms she understood were not legal, but that she was, sitting in this warm greenhouse in the amber afternoon, unable to construct an argument against. He told her about the medical school scholarship that had appeared in her second attempt at applying, which she had attributed to the quality of her essay, but which had, in fact, been supplemented by a donation to the institution from a private foundation with a name she had never had reason to investigate. He did not tell her all of this quickly. He told it slowly, methodically, in the tone of someone who has been carrying an account for a long time and is now rendering it fully, committed to the accuracy of every line. When he finished, the greenhouse was still warm, but the light had changed. It was later than she had realized, the afternoon having moved past itself into the earlier edge of evening, the light going golden and then amber through the glass panels. Clara sat with everything he had told her. She was aware of many things simultaneously. She was aware that what he had described was surveillance, and that surveillance without consent was a violation, and that a part of her had a right to be angry about that. She was aware that the scholarship had changed her trajectory. She would not have been able to return to medical school without it. The math had simply not worked, and she knew this and had known this, and that its source being what it was complicated the simple version of gratitude she had carried for years. She was aware that the dangerous man who had been watching her commute was gone in ways she did not fully want to examine, and that she was sitting in the home of the person responsible for that, and that her feelings about it were not simple. She was aware of all of this. She was also aware too, and this was the thing she could not put down, could not push aside into the column of information to be processed later, that a man had been hurt in a parking structure 10 years ago, and a 23-year-old nursing student had stopped and stayed, and that moment had become the fixed point around which an entire orbit had been constructed, and the orbit had kept her safe in ways she had never known. And the man who had built it was sitting 5 feet away from her on a wooden bench in her greenhouse, waiting for her to decide what to do with the truth. "Why did you agree to the marriage?" she asked. Her voice was even. She needed it to be even. The arrangement that was proposed, the families, the debt settlement, you could have simply resolved it the way you resolved everything else, from a distance, without becoming directly involved. "Yes," he said. "So why didn't you?" He was very still. "Because the Markov network was not a distant threat," he said. "They had been building towards something for 2 years, and I had been managing it, and I had believed I could continue to manage it without it reaching you directly. And then 6 months ago, I received information that changed that assessment." His voice was controlled, but she could hear, beneath it, the thing he was carefully regulating, the thing that had driven a man with 1,000 other available options to choose this one, this particular, intimate, irreversible option. They had identified you. They had your name. They had been building a file. I had perhaps 1 month before they made a move. And the marriage was the fastest way to place me inside a defensible perimeter, she said. Yes. A pause. And to give me the legal standing to protect you openly, rather than from a distance. And if I had refused, he looked at her. I would have found another way, he said. But the marriage was what I could offer your family in exchange for your consent. Without it, I had no mechanism to ask for your consent at all. She sat with that. You could have simply told me, come to me and told me the truth. I could have, he said quietly. But you didn't know me. You would have had no reason to believe me or to trust that what I was offering was genuine rather than a more sophisticated version of the threat. And I was not willing to... He stopped. Willing to what? He met her eyes. I was not willing to walk into your life with everything I am and everything I have done and ask you to take it on faith that I intended you well. You deserve better than that. You deserve to be in the situation long enough to form your own judgment, even if that judgment turned out not to be in my favor. The evening light came through the greenhouse glass and lay across the floor in long, warm bars, and Clara looked at Adrian Volkov, telling her that he had built a decade of careful distance around her life, and then walked through it himself rather than ask her to trust him blind. And she understood. Against every wall she had built, against every principled commitment to maintain distance that she had constructed over the 6 weeks since a wedding dress had felt like chains, that she was not angry. She was something very different from angry. "You are an extraordinarily complicated person," she said. Something broke in his expression, not shattering but opening, a quiet fracture along a line that had been under pressure for a very long time. "Yes," he said, "I know. I need time to think about everything you've just told me," she said. "There are parts of it that I have complicated feelings about, and I want to be honest with you about that rather than pretend I don't." "I would prefer your honesty over any alternative," he said. "I know you would. That is one of the less complicated parts." She stood up because she needed to move, needed the physical action of standing as an anchor. "But I want you to know something. While I'm thinking, and while I'm working through the parts that are complicated, I want you to know that I understand what it was, what all of it was, the intention of it." He stood as well, slowly. He was watching her with an attention so complete it was almost a physical thing, as though she were something he had waited a very long time to be able to look at without glass between them. "Clara," he said. "Not yet," she said gently. "Let me think first. Then we'll talk." She picked up the terracotta pot she had abandoned and set it on the shelf. "Come have dinner. Mrs. Hartley's been in the kitchen since 4, and I promised her we would eat at a reasonable hour." He stood for a moment longer, looking at her. Then he said, "All right." They walked back to the house through the garden in the early evening, side by side, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence against the cooling air. And she thought about 10 years of invisible architecture and a parking structure in October, and a jacket held against a wound. And she thought about the woman she had been at 23 who had stopped because leaving wasn't something she could do. She was still that woman. She had always been that woman. And the man walking beside her had known it for longer than she had known him. She did not sleep well that night, but it was a different kind of sleeplessness than the ones that had preceded it. Not the sleeplessness of anxiety or dread, but the sleeplessness of a mind working seriously on something that mattered, processing data with the focused intensity of a problem that had to be properly understood before anything could be decided. She lay in the white and gray room and she thought about what he had told her, all of it, in the specific order he had told it, and she allowed herself to feel all the things she felt. The complicated layers of it, the parts that required her to sit with a kind of violation she hadn't chosen, the parts that moved her in ways she was still calibrating, the parts that made her understand she had been safer than she knew for years, and that the safety had come from a person she had met once and never forgotten, and who had apparently never forgotten her. She thought about the fever dream quality of it, that a single act of ordinary human decency, a 23-year-old stopping because leaving wasn't something she could do, had been the seed of all of this. That kindness, unwitnessed and unrewarded and simply done because it was the right thing, had lodged itself in someone else's life and grown into something neither of them could have predicted. She thought about the wedding and the room at the end of the hall and the suture in the study. She thought about breakfast and tea and I intend to in the greenhouse and everything he had told her in the amber late afternoon. She thought, this is not a simple situation. It is not a simple man. And I am not a simple person for finding it, finding him, not what I expected. Somewhere past midnight, she heard a sound from down the hall. Not dramatic, just a brief, sharp sound, the kind of involuntary sound that a person makes when they've been asleep and something has interrupted it badly. The kind she recognized from the hospital, from sitting with patients who processed their pain in their sleep in ways they controlled during waking hours. She lay still for a moment. Then she got up. She walked down the hallway in the dark, not for any reason she could have articulated to a neutral observer, not because she had assessed the situation and determined that intervention was required, but because something in her moved toward it before her reasoning caught up, the same instinct that had stopped her in a parking structure 10 years ago. The same instinct that had always been the truest thing about her. She knocked softly on the door at the end of the hall. Silence. She knocked again. Yes. His voice was alert immediately, the alertness of a person who never fully surrendered consciousness, but beneath the alertness she heard what she had heard from the hallway. Something compressed, something held. She opened the door. His room was larger than hers and darker. The curtains drawn against the city light, everything in shadow except the faint ambient glow from the window's edges. He was sitting up in bed, and she could see in the darkness that his hands were loose at his sides in a way that looked like an effort, like someone who has just arrived at stillness from something that was not still. "Clara," he said. I heard you, she said simply. He didn't say anything. She crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, not far from him, close enough that he would be aware of her presence without it being an imposition. The way she would have sat with a patient, close enough to matter, careful enough not to overwhelm. You don't have to explain it, she said. I know, he said. They sat in the dark, and outside the city moved in its eternal amber hum, and the house was quiet around them, and she became aware, gradually and then completely, that something had shifted in the space between them, that the architecture of distance she had built and he had honored was not collapsing but transforming, becoming something with a different structure, something that had more room in it. He said, in the dark, very quietly, I used to have a recurring situation in my sleep, for years. Something from a long time ago. A pause. It stopped approximately 6 weeks ago. She looked at him in the darkness. Around the time you came to this house, he said. She sat with that for a long moment. And tonight, she asked. Tonight, he said, and there was something in his voice she hadn't heard before. Not vulnerability exactly. Not the word she would have reached for first, but something adjacent to it. Something that was what vulnerability looked like in a person who had spent decades making himself impervious to it. Tonight it came back. The version where I am in that parking structure and no one stops. She understood then. He had told her the truth today, all of it, the full weight of 10 years. And tonight his sleeping mind had returned to the version where it went differently, the version where she kept walking. I stopped, she said quietly. That is the version that happened. The other one didn't. I know, he said. Adrian. She said his name the way she had said it in the library weeks ago, naturally, without the weight of a performance, just the word for who he was. Look at me. He turned his head toward her in the dark. I'm here, she said. It was simple and it was not simple. It was the plainest sentence she could construct, and it carried everything she had been thinking since the greenhouse, and everything she had not yet said, and everything that she was still working through and was going to keep working through because it deserved the work. I am right here. He looked at her for a long moment in the dark. Then slowly, with the particular quality of a man who has held a great deal of weight for a very long time and is learning, carefully, incrementally, with profound unfamiliarity, how to set some of it down, he let out a breath. Just a breath. Long and slow and quiet. I know, he said. And this time when he said it, it sounded like something coming to rest. She stayed until she heard his breathing even out, and then she went back down the hallway to her own room, and she lay down in the gray and white dark, and she thought about what she was feeling, which was large and complicated and not yet fully formed, but was absolutely irrevocably real. She had come here as a sacrifice. She had come here to survive. She had not come here to find out that survival and the thing that was now growing inside her chest were, perhaps, pointing in the same direction. But they were. And in 2 days, when she woke at 4 a.m. with her body burning and the room tilting around her and a fever that had arrived with the sudden viciousness that only fevers know how to muster, it would be Adrian who came through the door with a cold cloth and a thermometer and sat beside her through the night, steady and present and refusing to leave. And that would be the moment, the clearest and most undeniable one, when Clara Bennett stopped trying to maintain any version of a principled distance from the truth of what she felt. But that was still 2 days away. Tonight, she lay in the dark and listened to the quiet house, and she was not afraid of what was coming. The fever came for her at 4:17 in the morning. She knew the exact time because she had looked at the clock on the nightstand in the moment she woke. That sharp, disorienting emergence from sleep that the body performs when something has gone wrong with its interior temperature, when the thermostat has been seized by something that has its own agenda entirely. The room was dark, and she was burning, and the ceiling was slightly uncertain in a way that ceilings should not be. And she lay still for a moment performing the automatic clinical assessment. Fever, significant, onset rapid, no preceding symptoms she had noticed, which meant either she had been too distracted in the last 48 hours to notice them, which was possible given the considerable quantity of information she had been processing, or the onset genuinely had been rapid, which happened. She tried to sit up. The room renegotiated its relationship with horizontal in a way she found unhelpful. She lay back down. She thought, with the slightly blurred practicality of a person whose internal temperature has crossed the line into territory that affects cognition at the edges. This is inconvenient. She was not, she assessed, in danger. She was a nurse practitioner. She could read her own body with reasonable accuracy, and what she was reading was a fever that was high but not critical, the kind that required management and rest and fluids, and not the kind that required emergency intervention. She knew the difference. She had always known the difference. What she needed was water and something to bring the fever down, both of which were in the bathroom 12 feet away, which was 12 feet further than her body was currently enthusiastic about traveling. She tried again, made it to sitting. The room performed its unhelpful renegotiation. She sat on the edge of the bed, with her hands flat on the mattress, and waited for the dizziness to pass, and thought that she should have caught this earlier, that she had been so thoroughly occupied with the events of the greenhouse and the night that followed, and everything she had been thinking in the 48 hours since that she had apparently neglected to maintain adequate awareness of her own physical condition, which was professionally embarrassing. She stood, made it 4 feet toward the bathroom, caught herself on the doorframe. The door to her room opened. She turned her head, carefully, because turning it too fast produced results she would rather avoid, and Adrian was in the doorway. He was in dark trousers and a gray shirt that was untucked, and his hair was slightly less controlled than its daytime version, and he was looking at her with an expression that processed what it was seeing and moved immediately into a different register. "How long?" he said, already crossing the room. "I just woke up," she said. "It came on fast." He reached her at the doorframe, and his hand went to her forehead with a directness that bypassed any awkwardness because the situation had made awkwardness irrelevant. His palm was cool against her skin, and she was aware of how hot her own face felt in contrast. "Come back to bed," he said. "I need water and ibuprofen. The ibuprofen is in my bag by the desk." "I'll get them. Come back to bed first." She did not argue. She turned around and made her careful way back to the bed with his hand at her elbow, steadying without gripping, and sat down and then lay down with the specific relief of a person whose body has been arguing with them about vertical orientation and has now gotten what it wanted. He brought water first, a full glass, from the bathroom, and then found the ibuprofen in her bag without searching for more than 30 seconds, which meant he had paid attention to where she kept things at some point without making a production of the attention. He handed her both, and she took the medication and drank the water and lay back, and he pulled the desk chair to the side of the bed and sat in it. "You don't have to stay," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him sitting in the desk chair in the gray shirt in the dark room, and thought about the fact that 2 nights ago she had walked down this hall toward him for the same reason he was now sitting in this chair beside her, because leaving wasn't something either of them could do, and felt the circular, inevitable quality of it settle into her chest with a warmth that the fever had not produced. "I'm not in danger," she said. "Medically. I want you to know that." "I know you know the difference," he said. "I'm still staying." She didn't argue again. He stayed. He sat in the desk chair through the first hour while the medication worked its way through her system, and she drifted in and out of the lighter edges of sleep, and every time she surfaced, he was there. Not hovering, not performing concern, just present, the way she had been present in his room 2 nights before, close enough to matter and careful enough not to overwhelm. He brought more water at some point. At another point, he got a cloth from the bathroom and folded it and set it against her forehead without speaking, without the slight self-consciousness that the gesture might have carried in a different moment between 2 different people. And she felt the cool of it against her skin and thought, "We have gotten very good at taking care of each other without making a performance of it." Somewhere in the 3rd hour, her fever began to come down. She could feel it, that gradual, reluctant retreat, the interior temperature returning towards something reasonable. The ceiling stopped being uncertain. Her thinking began to clear at the edges. She opened her eyes. He was still in the chair, still awake, and she understood with sudden clarity that he had not slept, that he had been sitting in that chair and not sleeping for the entire duration. And something about that broke through whatever remaining wall she had been maintaining between observation and feeling and went directly into her chest like something sharp and clean. "Adrian," she said. He looked at her immediately. "How do you feel?" "Better, coming down." She looked at him across the small space of the darkened room. "You haven't slept." "I'm fine." That is a non-answer, and we have established that I know the difference. She pushed herself up to sitting, slowly, and the ceiling maintained its proper relationship with horizontal this time. Come here. He looked at her. Adrian, come here. She moved over on the bed, making room, and looked at him steadily. I'm a nurse practitioner. I'm not in danger. You have been in that chair for 3 hours. Come here and sleep. He stood from the chair. He crossed the room. He sat on the edge of the bed, carefully, with the quality of someone doing something for the first time and being precise about it. And then, when she did not move away, when she simply looked at him with the expression that was her particular version of, I mean exactly what I said, he lay down on top of the covers beside her and looked at the ceiling. She lay back down. They were close but not touching. The room was quiet. I found the documents, she said. He turned his head toward her. While you were gone, she said. The 3 days. Mrs. Hartley gave me access to the house. She didn't restrict anything. I don't think she was told to restrict anything. And I was in the library one afternoon and I was looking through the shelf above the desk, and there was a folder. She kept her voice even. My name is on the front of it. He was very still. I opened it, she said. I read it. She had. She had stood in the library with afternoon light coming through the windows and read, page by page, the comprehensive, meticulous record of 10 years of invisible care. The medical bills, several of them, from a time when her father's coverage had lapsed, and bills had arrived that her family had told her were being handled without adequately explaining how. The scholarship documentation, the actual underlying structure of it, the donation from the foundation that she now knew was his, the specific language that had allowed her to return to school when the numbers hadn't added up. Smaller things, a gap in a legal proceeding against her brother's business partner that had resolved unexpectedly in her brother's favor at a time when everyone involved had believed it would not. A police report from her neighborhood 3 years ago that had led to an arrest that had felt like unusual efficiency from a department not known for it. And earlier, much earlier, a photograph, not of her, but of the parking structure taken in daylight from the entrance, attached to a note in his handwriting that she had recognized as his after weeks of watching him write, reading only 3 words. She didn't leave. She had stood in the library with that piece of paper in her hand, and she had let herself feel everything, all of it, the full inventory of it. And then she had put it back in the folder and put the folder back on the shelf, and she had gone to the greenhouse, and she had sat with the tomatoes, and she had thought, for a very long time, about what it meant. I know you found it, he said. She turned her head toward him. You knew? I noticed, he said quietly. The folder was moved slightly. I know its position. A pause. I decided not to address it unless you chose to bring it to me. You were waiting. I was giving you space to decide what to do with it. She looked at the ceiling. The fever had retreated enough that she could think clearly, and she was using that clarity now, organizing what she wanted to say with the same care she used for things that mattered. I want to tell you something, she said, and I need you to listen to the whole thing before you respond, because there are several parts and they don't all point in the same direction, and I think the honest thing is to give you all of them rather than just the easiest one. All right, he said. There are parts of what I read that I have complicated feelings about, she said. The surveillance, the depth of it, the length of it. I understand why it was done. I understand the intention. I also have to be honest that there is a part of me that has to sit with the fact that my life was being watched in ways I didn't consent to, even if the watching was protective, even if the intervention was every time genuinely on my behalf. That is a real thing. It's not the loudest thing I feel about it, but it is real, and I am not going to pretend it isn't. You shouldn't, he said. His voice was quiet and fully serious. It was a violation of your privacy regardless of its intent. I knew that when I made the decisions I made. I don't ask you to overlook it. I know you don't, she said. That is part of why I am also telling you the other thing. He was listening with his whole body. She could feel the quality of his attention the way you feel weather, as something present and real in the room. The note, she said, the photograph and the 3 words. She paused. She didn't leave. She felt the words in her mouth with the particular weight they carried. I stood in the library for a long time holding that piece of paper. And what I kept thinking was, I didn't leave that night because I couldn't. Because it wasn't a choice, it was just what was true about me. I have always been the person who stays. It has never felt like a decision. It has just felt like the only available action. She paused again. But you took that moment, a moment I didn't experience as remarkable. A moment I would have told you was simply the right thing done without particular significance, and you built 10 years around it. You remembered it when I had filed it in a drawer somewhere. You let it be the thing that mattered most. The room was very quiet. And I am trying, she said, to find the language for what it means to discover that someone has seen you that clearly, for that long, from that distance, without asking anything back, without revealing themselves, just seeing you, keeping you safe, waiting. Her voice remained steady, but only barely. I am a practical woman. I believe in evidence, and I believe in what I can verify, and I do not generally make large declarations on insufficient data. She turned her head toward him. But I have sufficient data now, Adrian. I've been collecting it for 8 weeks, and I have sufficient data. He turned his head toward her. What does your data tell you? He said, very quietly. That you are the most complicated person I have ever encountered, she said. That you have done things I cannot fully endorse, and things I cannot imagine anyone else having done for me. That this situation is not what I thought it was when I walked down that aisle, and that you are not who I thought you were. She held his gaze in the dark. And that I have been in love with the person I am discovering you to be for approximately 3 weeks, and I'm only now saying so out loud because a fever has apparently impaired my ability to maintain principled silence on the subject. Something happened to his expression. She had watched his face for 8 weeks and cataloged every register of it, and she had never seen it do what it did now. The controlled surface of it simply releasing, not dramatically, not in a way that produced any kind of performance, but completely. The way a held breath releases when something has been resolved, all at once, quietly, and with profound relief. Clara, he said. You don't have to say anything back, she said quickly. I'm not... Clara. His voice was the quietest it had ever been with her. Not soft exactly, but precise, the way only things that are entirely true are precise. I have been in love with you since a parking structure 10 years ago. I have spent a decade telling myself it was a debt, then a responsibility, then an obligation, because those were categories I knew how to function inside. A pause. Every other category I was less prepared for. She looked at him. I am less prepared for it now than I would like to be, he said, given that I am a person who generally prefers to be prepared. Something broke open in her chest, not painfully, not the breaking of something that should have stayed whole, but the breaking of something that had been keeping itself too tightly closed and had been ready to open for some time. She laughed, quietly and unexpectedly, and he looked at her with that expression she loved, the not quite amusement that was warmer than amusement, that was him being moved by something and allowing himself to show it. We are a remarkably inconvenient situation, she said. We are, he agreed. I still have complicated feelings about the surveillance, she said. That doesn't disappear because of this conversation. I know, he said. I'm not asking it to. And there are things about your work that we are going to have to talk about. Not tonight, but eventually. Yes, he said. We will. And I need you to understand that I am not a person who can be managed or protected without being informed. If there are threats, I need to know about them. If there are decisions that affect my life, I need to be part of making them. I understand that, he said. I am trying to learn it. She held his gaze. You're doing better than you were 8 weeks ago. You're a good teacher, he said. She turned back toward the ceiling. They lay side by side in the dark with 2 inches of space between them, and the quiet of the house settled around them, and she felt her fever-warm body beginning to further normalize, the interior temperature finding its way back to something reasonable. And she thought about everything that had been said and everything that was still to be navigated and felt, despite the considerable complexity of all of it, something she had not expected to feel in this house or with this man. She felt certain, not certain in the way of a conclusion reached and closed, certain in the way of a foundation being established, solid enough to build on, solid enough to stand on when the things that were still to come arrived and demanded to be dealt with. She fell asleep before she was aware of being tired. When she woke, the room was gray with early morning, and he was still there, not in the same position, turned slightly toward her, asleep. Finally, with the deep stillness of someone who had gone out completely and was not performing composure because he was unconscious, and composure was not required. She watched him for a moment in the gray light and felt the full quiet weight of everything. And then she got carefully out of bed and went to the bathroom and assessed herself in the mirror. Pale, eyes slightly tired, fever clearly broken, functional. She went downstairs and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window looking at the garden. And she thought about what came next. What came next arrived, as it turned out, faster than she had anticipated. 3 days after her fever broke, on a Tuesday afternoon when the sky was the particular gray-white of late autumn doing its best impression of winter, Reeves came to find her in the library with an expression that was professionally composed in the way that indicated something had happened that required composure to be professionally maintained. "There's been a development," he said. "Mr. Volkov asked me to bring you to the main office." She set down the journal. She looked at Reeves. "How serious?" "Serious," he said. The main office was a room she had not been in before. On the ground floor, behind the staircase, a room with no windows and walls lined with monitors that were currently showing feeds from various angles inside and outside the property. 3 men she knew by sight, but not by name, were in the room when she entered, the particular quality of their attention indicating that whatever the situation was, it had everyone's focus. Adrian was at the desk, standing rather than sitting, looking at something on the central screen. He looked up when she came in, and his expression did the rapid assessment she had come to recognize, checking her, making sure she was all right, before returning to the situation at hand. And then he said, "Come look at this." She went to the desk. On the screen was a photograph. A man she didn't recognize, taken in what appeared to be a public space, talking to 2 other men whose faces were partially visible. One of the partially visible faces she did recognize after a moment. It was a man she had seen at the wedding reception, someone who had moved with the careful deliberateness of the people in Adrian's orbit. "The Markov network has made a move," Adrian said. His voice was the fully operational version, stripped of everything personal, fully focused. "They have approached 3 of my operational partners in the last 72 hours. Not with threats, with offers. They're trying to fracture your organization from the inside," she said. He looked at her. "Yes. Is it working?" "2 of the 3 came to me directly," he said. "The 3rd has not." He looked at the screen. "The 3rd has worked with me for 11 years. She heard what was beneath the operational tone. Not much, but enough. The particular weight of a betrayal that is not yet confirmed but that is becoming impossible to deny. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I'm going to give him the opportunity to come to me himself," he said. 24 hours. If he doesn't, I'll need to address it directly." He looked at her. "I wanted you to understand what is happening, fully, not a managed version." She held his gaze. "Thank you for that." "The house security is increased as of this morning," he said. "I want you to stay in the main building for now, not the greenhouse." "All right," she said. She watched him. "Are you all right?" The room had 3 other people in it. He looked at her across the desk with 3 other people in the room and said, without any apparent concern for what 3 other people might observe or interpret, "I'm better now that you're in the room." She saw the 3 other men find immediate and urgent interest in the monitors. She kept her eyes on Adrian. "Okay," she said quietly. "Then I'll stay in the room." She did. The 24 hours that followed were the most operationally intense she had yet experienced in the house. A steady, controlled stream of information arriving and being processed. Conversations in low voices behind closed doors. Reeves moving through the building with quiet frequency. She stayed out of the way of things that were not her domain and in the room for the things that were, keeping coffee coming, keeping herself available, understanding that her role in this specific situation was not operational but was not nothing, that presence itself was a kind of function. At the 23-hour mark, the 3rd man called. She was in the office when it happened, and she watched Adrian take the call, and she watched his face during it. He said very little. He listened mostly, and asked 3 short questions, and listened again, and at the end he said, quietly and without heat, "Come tomorrow morning. Bring what you have. We'll talk," and ended the call. He set the phone down. He looked at her. "He came," she said. "He came," he said. "He took their offer." And then he decided he didn't want to live with the alternative, which was? The alternative, Adrian said, was becoming the kind of person who would do that to someone who trusted him. He found he didn't want to be that person. She looked at him. What will happen to him? He will be removed from anything sensitive, he said. He will be given an exit. He will not be harmed. He said it plainly, without drama, as a simple statement of fact. I am not interested in punishment. I am interested in the situation being resolved. She had come to this house prepared, among other things, to discover that she was living adjacent to violence. She had prepared herself for that, had built a category for it, a way of holding the moral complexity of it at enough distance to continue functioning. She had found, instead, a man who was ruthless in the protection of what mattered to him and considerably less interested in brutality than his reputation suggested, who resolved things rather than destroyed them, wherever that was possible, who said, I am not interested in punishment, and meant it. The world had a story about Adrian Volkov. She had been given that story before she ever met him, in careful, cautious language, in the tone people used when describing things that frightened them. The story said, ruthless, dangerous, unmerciful. A man who used power the way a hammer uses nails. The man in front of her was those things, in certain registers and certain situations, and she did not deceive herself about that. But the man in front of her was also the man who had sat in a desk chair for 3 hours in the dark to make sure she had water, who had said, I am not interested in punishment about someone who had, by any operational standard, earned considerably worse, who had given her a room at the end of a hallway and called it hers. The world's story about him was not false. It was simply incomplete. And she was, she understood, the person who currently held the most complete version of it. That understanding sat with her through the remainder of that day and into the evening, which was quiet in the way that follows tension when the tension has been adequately addressed. A different quality of quiet than tension itself, something that had room in it. They ate dinner at the kitchen table and talked about things that were not the crisis, because the crisis had been contained for now, and the space that the crisis had been occupying needed something else put into it. She told him about her brother's daughter, 8 years old, possessed of opinions about everything, currently in a phase of wanting to be a marine biologist. He asked questions about the marine biology phase that were genuinely interested rather than politely so. He told her, tentatively at first, and then more fully when she asked follow-up questions, about a property in the north, farmland, 30 acres, that he had owned for 5 years and done nothing with because there had always been something more pressing. He described it with a quality in his voice she had not heard before, something that was almost shy, or the closest approximation of shy she had ever heard from him. She listened to the quality of it rather than the words, and understood that the property meant something to him that he had not admitted to anyone else. What would you do with it, she asked, if there was time? He looked at the table for a moment. Something quieter, he said, something that grows rather than controls. He looked up at her. I don't know how to be more specific than that yet. That's specific enough, she said. Later, standing in this hallway between their doors, that hallway that had been the geography of the careful distance they had maintained and were now maintaining differently, he turned toward her and she toward him, and there was a moment that was simply a moment, without agenda, without performance. Just two people at the end of a long and complicated day standing in a hallway that belonged to both of them. Clara, he said. I know, she said. Do you? She looked at him. You're going to tell me you're sorry. For the circumstances. For asking this of your family, of me. For the fact that the world outside this house is complicated in ways that I didn't sign up for. He looked at her steadily. Don't, she said. Not unkindly, with the particular gentleness of someone who means what they are saying completely. I am here. I am here by my own understanding now, which is different from being here by arrangement. The apology is noted and set aside. She held his gaze. What I want from you is not an apology. What I want from you is what I asked for in the greenhouse. The truth. All of it. Always. Yes, he said. And I want the farmland to stop sitting empty, she said. Whatever quieter thing you want to build there, build it. Something moved across his face. The full, unguarded version she was still not entirely accustomed to, because it was still somewhat new and somewhat extraordinary in a man who had spent 30 years learning not to let things show. We, he said. Build it. She held his gaze for a long moment. We, she agreed. She turned and went into her room, and she stood at the window looking at the dark garden where the greenhouse sat with its light still on. Mrs. Hartley's timer, running through the night to manage the interior temperature for the plants. And she thought about 30 acres in the north and something that grows rather than controls, and a man who had loved her for 10 years from behind glass and was now, finally, being allowed to love her from the same room. She was not finished being complicated about all of it. The surveillance, the scholarship, the decade of watching, those were things she would continue to process, would bring to him again in moments when they needed to be looked at, would hold him accountable to as the ongoing practice of the honesty she had asked for. She was not a woman who resolved things by burying them, and she was not going to start. But she was also a woman who had stopped in a parking structure 10 years ago because leaving wasn't something she could do. And she was still that woman. And she was staying. The Markov network did not go quietly. Clara had understood, in the abstract, that the situation with the men at the gate and the fractured loyalty and the offers being made to Adrian's partners was not a thing that would resolve itself neatly in the span of a single tense evening. She had understood it the way you understand things you have not yet lived through, intellectually, at a remove, with the knowledge that the actual experience of it would be different from the model. She was a practical woman. She had always known the gap between the model and the thing itself. What she had not fully modeled was the particular quality of the 3 weeks that followed. They were not dramatic in the way she had braced for. There were no confrontations in the house, no violence that arrived at the door, no moments that required the kind of acute crisis response she had been preparing herself for since she had understood the shape of the world she was living inside. What there was instead was a sustained grinding pressure, the kind that doesn't announce itself in single moments, but accumulates in the texture of daily life, in the slight increase of tension in every room, in the way Reeves moved through the house with a frequency and alertness that was measurably higher than his baseline, in the phone calls that came at odd hours and that Adrian took standing up rather than sitting down. She watched him carry it. That was the primary thing she did in those 3 weeks, alongside the ordinary things. The greenhouse, the library, the breakfast conversations that they maintained with a deliberateness that she understood was itself a kind of decision, a refusal to let the pressure collapse the ordinary structure of their days. She watched him carry what he was carrying, and she learned something new about him in the watching, that he was very good at it, and that being very good at it cost something, and that the cost was most visible in the hour before he slept, in the particular quality of his exhaustion in those last minutes of the evening when the operational discipline of the day had been released and what was underneath it became briefly visible. She stayed for those minutes. She made them a habit without discussing it, simply appearing, reliably, in the kitchen or the library or the hallway at the end of the day, available and undemanding and present, because she had told him she was the person who stays, and she intended to make that true in every register, including this one. He noticed. He didn't say so directly. That was not how he communicated the things that mattered most to him, she had learned. The things that mattered most arrived in the texture of his behavior rather than in declaration. But she felt it in the way the last hour of each day gradually became something he moved toward rather than simply arrived at. In the way the exhaustion in his face had something in it that was not only exhaustion. On a Thursday evening in the second week, sitting in the kitchen with tea long past midnight, while the house was quiet and the security team maintained its discreet perimeter outside, he told her what the Markov network actually wanted. It was not, as it turned out, purely territorial. It was not the simple calculation of one criminal organization absorbing the operational space of another. It was older than that and more personal, and it involved a decision Adrian had made 8 years ago, a decision that had ended a partnership and created in the person whose partnership had been ended a sustained and patient intention toward retribution that had waited for the right moment and had now, apparently, decided that this was it. A man named Gregor Voss, Adrian said. He was looking at the table rather than at her, and she understood this as the posture he took when telling her things that required the telling, but that he found difficult, not because they were operationally sensitive, but because they were personally so. He and I built the first significant structure of what I now operate, together, equally. What happened? He was quiet for a moment. Voss made a decision that would have required us to move against a civilian family, a specific family that owed a debt they couldn't pay. His position was that the debt was real, and the consequence was the appropriate one. He paused. I disagreed. She looked at him. I dissolved the partnership, he said. I absorbed the operational costs of doing so. They were considerable. And I cleared the family's debt from my own resources and made sure Voss understood that moving against them himself would be an unacceptable course of action. He looked up at her. He understood, and he left. And he spent 8 years building the Markov network, and now he believes the moment has arrived to demonstrate that my decision 8 years ago was a mistake. She sat with this for a moment. Was it? By the calculations of your world? He held her gaze. By the calculations of my world, it was strategically suboptimal, he said. I lost resources. I lost operational reach. I spent 2 years recovering the ground I'd ceded. By those calculations, it was a mistake. And by yours? By mine, he said. It was the only available decision. She looked at him across the kitchen table in the late-night quiet and thought about a man who operated in a world defined by ruthless calculation, choosing, 8 years ago, the option that cost him everything by that world's accounting because a family was going to be hurt, and he was the person who could prevent it. She thought about a parking structure, and she didn't leave, and she thought about the through line of it, the consistent, load-bearing fact of who he was underneath everything the world said he was. What are you going to do about Voss? She asked. I'm going to end it, he said. Not him, the network, the infrastructure he has built. There are legal mechanisms available to me now that weren't available 8 years ago. I have been working with certain parties over the last 2 years to establish the groundwork. He paused. It will take another few weeks, but it will be done properly, and it will be done permanently, and it will not require the kind of resolution that I am no longer interested in pursuing. She understood what he meant by the kind of resolution he was no longer interested in pursuing. She had understood, over 8 weeks of accumulating data, that he had been moving for longer than she had been in this house, driven by impulses she now understood had always been there, toward a different way of operating, away from the methods that his reputation was built on, not all at once, not cleanly, not without the complicated navigation of a world that didn't easily accommodate that kind of transition, but genuinely and with sustained intention. The farmland, she said. He looked at her. Is that part of it? The transition? He was quiet for a moment in the way that preceded his most honest answers. Yes, he said. I have been building towards something different for 2 years. What I do now, what I have been doing, it doesn't have to be the permanent condition. It was the condition I was in when I didn't have a better option, and I built it into something that functions, and it has functioned, but it is not what I want the rest of my life to look like. What do you want it to look like? She asked. He looked at her across the table with the fully unguarded expression that she was still, even now, still slightly unprepared for in its completeness. This, he said simply, this kitchen, this hour, you asking me questions I don't have prepared answers for. A pause. The farmland, something that grows. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then let's get through the next few weeks, she said, and then we'll go look at the farmland. He looked at her as though she had said something that required a moment to fully land. Together, she said, because she wanted to be clear. We'll go together. Yes, he said, and the way he said it was the way he had said, I intend to, when she told him to come back. And we, when she had said, build it, with the particular quality of a man receiving something he had not allowed himself to fully expect, and was now holding with enormous care. The resolution of the Markov network came not with violence, but with the particular finality of a structure being legally and permanently dismantled. On a Monday morning 3 weeks later, Reeves came into the library where Clara was reading and said that Mr. Volkov had asked her to come to the office, and she went. And when she entered the room, Adrian was standing at the desk with his phone in his hand and an expression on his face that she had never seen before. Or rather, she had seen its components separately, in fragments, but never assembled into this particular configuration. Relief was part of it. An exhaustion, the deep kind that follows a sustained effort that has finally concluded. And something else that was quieter and larger than both of those things. It's done, he said. She looked at him. Voss? In custody as of this morning. Federal jurisdiction. It's been building for 18 months and the evidence was sufficient for a full warrant. He set the phone down. The network's operational infrastructure has been seized. There are people with legitimate authority handling the rest of it, and they will handle it properly. She crossed the room and stood in front of him. She looked at his face and read everything in it that he was not putting into words. The full accumulated weight of what the last month had cost him, and the thing that was now possible that had not been possible while that weight was being carried. "It's over," she said. "Yes," he said. She reached up and put her hand against the side of his face. It was the first time she had touched him that way, deliberately, not in the context of medical attention or the accidental proximity of shared space, but as herself, choosing it. And she felt the slight tension in him at the contact, and then the release of it, the way he leaned into it, almost imperceptibly, the way a person leans toward warmth without being aware they're doing it. "Good," she said. He put his hand over hers, and they stayed like that for a moment in the office, with the monitors dark and the house quiet, and the long, difficult chapter of the last month folding itself away into the past. And she felt something settle in the room around them, something that had been held taut for a very long time, finally finding its resting position. 2 days later, he came to find her in the library. She knew something specific was happening from the way he was standing, in the doorway, with a posture that was slightly more formal than his usual, a quality of deliberateness in his stillness that she had come to associate with moments of significant intention. He had a large envelope in his hand, the kind that comes from a lawyer's office, cream-colored and sealed. She set down her book. "What is that?" He crossed the room and set it on the table beside her. She looked at it without picking it up. On the front, in formal type, was her name, and below it his. And below that, the name of a legal firm she recognized as the one that had handled the marriage documentation. "Open it," he said. She picked it up. She opened it. Inside was a document of several pages, and she read the first page with the focused attention she brought to things that required understanding before response. And she understood before she finished the first page what it was. It was a dissolution, a full and legal termination of their marriage, prepared completely, requiring only her signature on the final page to be enacted. Every detail addressed. There were no shared assets in her name that she had not brought into the arrangement, and those were specifically protected in language that ensured she would leave with everything she had come with and nothing encumbered, clean, complete. Her exit, fully prepared, fully available, asking nothing of her except the decision. She looked up at him. He was standing at the window. He had moved while she was reading, giving her space to receive it without his eyes on her, looking out at the garden where the late autumn had taken most of the remaining leaves and left the trees in their winter shapes, spare and honest. "The threat is resolved," he said. His voice was steady. "What I asked you to do when I arranged this marriage, what your family agreed to, what you agreed to, was contingent on a situation that no longer exists. The debt between our families was always a mechanism, not a genuine obligation." He paused. "You owe me nothing." "You never did." She looked at the document in her hands. "This is—" she started. "Your choice," he said. He turned from the window and looked at her, not with the blankness of the early days, not with the controlled surface that had been his primary defensive architecture when she first arrived, with the full, unguarded face she had spent 8 weeks learning and that she now knew as well as she knew her own. "I want to be absolutely certain," he said, "that whatever you choose to do next, you are choosing it. Not because there is pressure in either direction, not because of obligation or arrangement, or because you have been inside these walls long enough that this has come to feel like the only available reality." He held her gaze. "If you want to leave, this is how you leave, completely and without condition." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the woman who had walked down an aisle in a soaked wedding dress and performed the vows in a clear voice because leaving wasn't something she could do. She thought about everything that woman had found in the place she had come to as a sacrifice. The room at the end of a hall, the suture in the study, the breakfast conversations and the greenhouse and the parking structure, and 10 years of invisible architecture and a fever at 4 in the morning, and a man who had sat in a desk chair and not slept. She thought about the farmland, 30 acres, something that grows. She looked down at the document in her hands. She took the last page, the signature page, between her fingers. She looked at the line where her name was meant to go, and she tore it in half. Not dramatically. She didn't stand up, didn't make a speech of it. She simply tore the signature page cleanly across and set both halves on the table beside her book, and she looked up at Adrian Volkov standing at the window of his library in the pale November light, and she said, "I am choosing." He looked at her with that face, the one she loved, the one that was him without the armor, the one she had worked 8 weeks to earn the right to see. "Clara, I am choosing this," she said clearly, "not because I'm trapped here, not because the walls have come to feel like the only reality, because I have sufficient data." She held his gaze. "Because you sat in a chair for 3 hours in the dark so I would have water. Because you said she didn't leave and kept it for 10 years. Because you told me the truth when you didn't have to, and you gave me this document when you absolutely didn't have to." She paused. "Because you are the most complicated and the most careful and the most unexpectedly decent person I have ever encountered, and I have made my assessment, and my assessment is that I want to be here." He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her close enough that she had to look up at him slightly, and he looked at her for a long moment with the full weight of everything he felt visible in his face, without any of the usual architecture in the way. "You are sure?" he said. Not a question. A confirmation he was asking for, with all the gravity of a man who needed to hear it said plainly. "I am sure," she said. He took her hands from her lap, both of them, and held them in his, and the warmth of it, the simple, unhurried warmth of it, was different from every other kind of contact they had navigated in 8 weeks. This was not medical. This was not comfort in a crisis. This was chosen, deliberately, by both of them, in the full possession of their understanding. "I have loved you," he said, "for a very long time." "I know," she said. "I'm here now." He brought her hands to his lips, the way he had at the altar. The same gesture, the same formality, but entirely different, because the altar had been performance and necessity, and this was neither. This was simply true. They went to see the farmland the following week. It was a 5-hour drive north through the city's outer boroughs, and then through the expanding countryside where the development thinned and the land began to reassert itself in the particular way of northern terrain, rolling and spare and honest, the kind of landscape that had no interest in being decorative and instead simply was what it was, completely. Clara sat in the passenger seat and watched it arrive around them and felt something in her chest loosen in a way that she hadn't anticipated. A response to space and sky and the absence of the city's constant insistence on itself. Adrian drove. He drove with the focused ease of someone who was good at most physical things he turned his attention to, one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the console between them. They talked intermittently, about the landscape, about the things she was noticing, about a conversation she'd had with her brother the day before, in which Daniel had been carefully and touchingly unable to ask the question he most wanted to ask, which was whether she was all right, and she had answered it anyway. Yes. Actually, yes. She had heard the relief in his silence, and it had sat warmly in her chest. She told Adrian this, and he listened and said, "Your brother is a good person." And she said, "He is. He was trying very hard to protect me from something I turned out not to need protecting from." And Adrian said quietly, "I know the feeling," and she laughed. The farmland appeared at the end of a gravel road that turned off the main road and climbed slightly before leveling out onto a flat, wide property with a farmhouse at its center. Old stone, good bones, windows that needed work, a roof that had been maintained better than the windows. Beyond the farmhouse, the land rolled away in 3 directions, brown and dormant in November, but with the particular quality of land that has been tended and would tend again in spring. They stood outside the car in the cold, clear air and looked at it. "It needs work," he said. "Everything worth having does," she said. He looked at her sideways with that expression, the warm one, the one she kept waiting to become ordinary, and that kept not becoming ordinary, kept arriving with its full weight every time. "I thought we might begin in the spring," he said. "The house first, and then the land." "What for the land?" He had thought about this. She could tell by the quality of the answer, which arrived without the pause that preceded his less prepared responses. "There's an organization in the city that works with families in housing transition," he said. They have a residential program, but their food security component is underfunded. Something like this, he gestured at the land, could supply it. She looked at the 30 acres and then at him. How long have you been planning that? Approximately 2 years, he said. I needed the other things to be resolved first. She turned back to the farmhouse. We'll need someone who knows about crops, she said. I know about greenhouse tomatoes, and that is the full extent of my agricultural expertise. I know someone, he said. Of course you do. She looked at him. You know someone for everything. Most things, he said. There were several things I did not know someone for until recently. She understood he meant her. She let herself receive it without deflecting, which was something she had been practicing. The deliberate choice not to minimize what he offered her, to let it land and be real rather than managing it back to a comfortable distance. I want to be part of building it, she said. Not adjacent to it, actually part of it. I know, he said. I would not have it any other way. And I want to go back to work. When things are stable. The emergency department, or something adjacent to it. I've been looking at a community clinic about 2 miles from the house that does underserved population work, and I think my background is well suited to what they need. He looked at her. You've already looked into it. I'm a practical woman, she said. I don't wait to start planning. No, he said, with the full version of the warm expression. You don't. They walked the perimeter of the property in the cold November air, their breath visible, the ground firm beneath them, and they talked about the farmhouse and the land and the clinic and the foundation and the things that would need to be done and in what order. And it was the most ordinary conversation she had had in months, the practical, detailed, forward-looking conversation of two people building something together. And it was, for that reason, perhaps the most extraordinary. 3 months later, on a Saturday morning when the late winter was beginning to lose its confidence and the first tentative signals of spring were arriving in the light, if not yet in the temperature, they were married again. Not in a cathedral, not with 200 people performing composure in expensive clothes. In the farmhouse, which had been substantially renovated over the winter, with a focus on the things that mattered most, the structural, the functional, the warm, and which still smelled pleasantly of fresh paint and old stone, and the particular scent of a wood fire that had been going since early morning. There were 14 people. Her mother, whose expression when she had arrived the night before and seen Clara in the kitchen of the farmhouse laughing at something Adrian had said, had been the expression of a woman revising a significant number of her assumptions simultaneously. Her brother Daniel and his wife, and the 8-year-old who had opinions about marine biology, and who had determined, upon meeting Adrian, that he was acceptable primarily because he had answered her question about bioluminescent deep-sea creatures with what she described as actual information, and not just the stuff adults say when they don't really know. Mrs. Hartley, who had made the food, which was extraordinary, and who had declined to make a speech on the grounds that the food said everything she intended to say. Reeves, who stood at the back in his characteristic quiet, and who, when she caught his eye, gave her a nod that communicated something she understood was its own form of considerable warmth. A handful of others, people from Adrian's world who had been present in it long enough that they were simply people now, particular individuals she had accumulated her own understanding of over the months. The ceremony was brief. They had written their own vows, which was something they had discussed once, briefly, and then both separately prepared for without further discussion, which she found characteristic of how they had arrived at most of the things that mattered most between them, not through elaborate negotiation, but through the quiet alignment of two people who, when they were paying attention, were often already moving in the same direction. She spoke hers first. She said, I came to you as a practical woman, committed to evidence, resistant to stories that hadn't been proven by the data. And the data, over the months I have spent learning who you are, has been unambiguous. You're complicated and careful and surprisingly, stubbornly decent. And you have shown me, without asking credit for it, without requiring me to acknowledge it on any particular schedule, what it looks like when someone decides that protecting the people they love is more important than protecting the image of themselves as someone who doesn't need to love anyone. She looked at him steadily, the way she had practiced looking at things that mattered without looking away. I choose you, with my full understanding of who you are and what that means. I choose you freely, which is the only way I know how to do anything. He was very still when she finished, the particular stillness that was his version of being moved beyond the capacity of the surface to contain it. He said, I have been trying to find the language for 10 years, for what you are to me, and what you changed, and what it has meant. I don't have it still, not completely. I don't think language gets fully adequate to some things. He paused. What I have is this. You stopped. When you could have walked by, when no one would have known or judged you for it, you stopped. And everything I have tried to be since that night, everything I have tried to build, every decision I have made towards something better than what I was capable of before, has been in some way an attempt to be worthy of that moment, of you. He looked at her. You have told me you are choosing this freely. I want you to know that I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never have reason to doubt that the choice was worth making. The farmhouse was very quiet. Outside, the late winter light lay pale and clean across the 30 acres, where the first preparations for spring planting had begun the week before. The land turned, ready, waiting for what would grow. Afterward, when the food had been eaten and the 14 people had filled the farmhouse with the particular warmth of a small gathering in which everyone present actually wanted to be there, Clara found a moment to step outside. She stood on the stone step of the farmhouse door in the cold, clear air and looked at the land in the late afternoon light, and she thought about a cathedral in the rain and a dress that felt like chains and a woman who had performed her vows in a clear voice because she had decided that whatever else that day took from her, it would not take her dignity. She heard the door open behind her. Adrian came to stand beside her, his shoulder against hers, both of them looking at the land. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I'm thinking about the woman who walked into your house 8 months ago," she said. She had prepared herself very thoroughly for the worst possible version of what she was walking into. She had built an entire internal architecture for surviving it. And she was prepared for entirely the wrong thing, Clara said, which is, in my experience, how the most important things tend to arrive. He turned his head toward her. She turned hers toward him. They were very close, shoulder to shoulder, in the cold air with the farmland in the last of the light, and he looked at her with the face she loved, fully his, fully present, fully given over to the fact of her. And she thought, this is what it looks like. This is the actual thing. "Are you glad?" he said, quietly, with the particular vulnerability of a man who has wanted something for a very long time and is still, even now, slightly uncertain of his right to have it. She looked at him. "I stopped in a parking structure 10 years ago," she said, "because leaving wasn't something I could do. And it turns out that was the most important thing I ever did." She held his gaze. "Yes, Adrian, I am glad." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, a gesture so ordinary and so careful that she felt it in her chest with a warmth that had nothing to do with the season. In the city, the community clinic had already accepted her application. She would begin in 6 weeks, and the work would be exactly what she had built herself for. The specific, demanding, meaningful work of being present for people who needed someone to stay. On the farmland, the spring planting was being planned. By summer, there would be something growing here that hadn't grown before, and by autumn it would begin finding its way to the families in the city who needed it, and the foundation that was being structured around it would carry the name of no one in particular because that was how Adrian had wanted it. Not a monument, not a legacy, just a function, just a thing doing the work it was built to do. He had spent 30 years building an empire of control. He was building something different now, and he was building it with her. And the difference between the two things was not complicated to name. One of them had been constructed from the outside in, from power and calculation and the logic of a world that respected nothing else. The other was being built from the inside out, from the specific gravity of two people who had chosen each other and intended to keep choosing each other, and from the understanding that, hard-won, improbably arrived at, entirely real, that what you protected by staying was worth more than anything you could have gained by walking away. Clara Bennett had walked down a rainy aisle as a sacrifice and had arrived on the other side of everything as herself. Fully, freely, finally herself. She took Adrian's hand in the cold afternoon air. He held it. The farmland lay before them in the last of the winter light, waiting for spring, waiting for what would grow, and it would grow.